So I tore my rotator cuff. Now, what does that fully mean in a host of ways? Well, one, a tear often is similar to the word strain, but we use it very differently, right? When someone says tear, we think ripped open, pulled apart. We think strain is like, oh, a little bit tight and those types of things. Note that those words are very synonymous. So if you strain your quad and you feel a little bit achy, it's very similar to tearing or having a strain in your rotator cuff. The rotator cuff is four muscles that hold things into place at the shoulder, and it could be any number of one of those things. But as PTs, we're kind of trained at how to differentiate those and what that means. Little did I know that I would be on the receiving end of one of those tears, and I have struggled my own self with my own rehabilitation. So I kind of want to walk you through, one, how did it happen? What are the things I'm feeling? How are we moving through it? And why is it so difficult to recover and heal from something like this when we just don't understand why it kind of feels icky and painful and just weird at some times and not at others? When I first had it happen, I knew what I had kind of done. I had the MO. I was too overzealous with the bench press program I was getting into. I could literally feel like a tearing sensation when it happened, and I continued to push through for the next 3 reps before I called it. Now, oftentimes that might not even be the case for certain people. They might just have a repetitive injury with the rotator cuff, or they might wake up more in the morning and just feel gunky, whereas I felt it in the moment. You can kind of have both. I had pretty good range of motion, but I had pain towards the end of it, both internal and external, and I felt some weakness, not a ton, but enough, especially pressing out or external rotation, as though I was kind of punching somebody right here, pushing into it. So immediately when I felt that, when I kind of felt that sort of dead, just kind of arm sensation, just a very kind of something inside my shoulder right here, almost like an arrow's going through. And I'm like, come on, like I was just driving, right? Then I noticed it when I was on my desktop computer and my elbow was off something and not supported, and I was going around with the mouse for a longer period of time of like a half an hour. Same thing. Shoulder would just be like gunky going overhead, wouldn't feel too great. Just like, come on. And then the worst was when I was sleeping. If I'd fall asleep on my right side, either it would hurt like the dickens or my arm would fall asleep, or I'd wake up the next morning and it felt like my shoulder had just gone through an insane workout. All three of those things are things I've heard before from patients, but this is really the first time I've had to experience something like that. Hopefully it gives me a lot more empathy, but also I understand why those three things are there. And I think that's why it's difficult for patients sometimes, because driving is not nearly the same thing as bench pressing. And why is my shoulder hurting from there? Because of that, we have to think about the role of the rotator cuff. So as a strain or a tear, yes, the rotator cuff can do internal rotation, external rotation, but it also functions a lot at helping keep your shoulder in place. As the most mobile and has most range of motion joint in the entire body, it's imperative that there's some sort of muscular restraint to hold that into place, and that's the four rotator cuff muscles that come around the head of it that help keep it in the appropriate position for everyday activity, right? From a bench press perspective, as I'm bench pressing, it's helping make sure that that head of my shoulder doesn't keep going forward, and helps it keeps it in place and keeps it in proper tension. From a baseball pitcher, it helps me crank my shoulder back to get to this position, and then follow through, slow everything down in terms of that. So it's very diverse in what it does, and that's why we see it with sleeping, driving, computer playing, whatever you're doing. It's always active, even just trying to resist your shoulder from falling from gravity, right? So that's kind of the relation between the function of the rotator cuff and why those stupid things like driving and computer and just sleeping are so frustrating for us overall. So the kicker being, I was like, you know what? I don't have time for this. Like we all think it'll just get better on its own. And I neglected it for 3 or 4 months, and a pandemic happened. So I just ran and neglected the shoulder. So that's when the driving, the computer, and the sleeping started happening. Not only that, but my right-sided neck from my right shoulder where I tore it started getting really tight. I felt like I had a crank in the right side of my neck all the time. Felt like there was a knot in my shoulder blade. Literally all the things patients have told me, and I'm like, cool, I get it now on a very deep and personal level, how frustrating this can be. The other part of that, though, is trying to find the amount of autonomy for me to actually do something about it. It didn't bother me enough, but I knew that every workout that I pushed into too hard and then took a week off, that I was doing wrong. I was spiking my activity and then I was resting. And that's never what I recommend to patients, but lo and behold, there I was, That's what I was doing. It really hit me then recently when I saw one of my patients with almost the exact same symptoms that I had. And he had started from developing a level of push-ups throughout the pandemic, right? Getting a few more every day, every week, and he was getting really strong. And then one day woke up and just felt really gunky. So he's kind of on the other opposite of that mechanism of injury for me in terms of what that is. For him though, we like, okay, let's change up a few things for you and see what's the simplest thing we can do because you don't necessarily have access to weights. What the simplest thing we can do is change his technique for his push-up to help support the rotator cuff to keep that shoulder in place while doing the push-up. And I think that's the common misconception about rotator cuff rehabilitation. It's not that we have to do all these fancy isolated exercises. Some can be beneficial, but it's that we need to find positions and quality of movement that you don't feel like that sort of dead, achy, pinchy, dead arm type feeling that you do during activity. Because usually you'll feel it and it won't feel pain, but it's the delayed onset of that the next day that just feels really gunky. And I think that's why rotator cuff issues are so difficult for people. So what do we do for that simplicity of rehab? What we did is we took his push-ups and we said, we're gonna do rotator cuff priming exercises, right? Priming in quotes, meaning let's do some isolated rotator cuff work and see if that helps with the more functional demands of the rotator cuff during a push-up. So sure enough, we did that. We did those priming things that I'll show you in just a second. And then we integrated some technique changes into his push-up. And I said I wanted him to do 5-6 sets a day with minimal reps, 2 to 4 at most. But each rep had to make sure he did not feel that sensation in the front of his shoulder or feel any of that ickiness, that gunkiness, that sort of pinching, trapping, stuff like that. Only positive reps. And once we were able to discover that, we've been seeing a steadily improvement. I realized I need to do that for my own. So I'm going to show you now exactly what those are for the priming and how I integrated it into push-ups and pull-ups. So what I did is I do both side-lying external rotation of my rotator cuff because we realize that it's the external rotation of my rotator cuff, not the internal. And so I work through that side line at the most safest spot. And then I also work through that at a 90-90 position to be able to work at a little bit more of a sensitive spot for it. After I do that to fatigue with both a little bit of weight and just my empty arm, you realize, wow, that's my rotator cuff, that's fatigue, I get it now. Once I kind of feel that primed or even pumped feeling, then I do my functional movements in terms of push-ups and pull-ups. Now, luckily for me, I've been able to do strict pulse for a very long time and I can do very high quality push-ups. If you don't have those, there's other ways to move around this and do that separately at maybe a slightly different scale. And that's okay. The biggest positive out of this is that positive rep idea. Can I do a movement very, very slowly and not feel like that pinch, that ickiness, that gunkiness, whatever synonym of your symptoms you have here in that shoulder at that time? You can have slow, positive reps. Do them daily. You'll get more bang for your buck during all those other activities when your shoulders work. So it was the priming rotator cuff stuff. It was the push-ups and pull-ups. And it was just the utter consistency of those on a daily basis that really has gotten my shoulder to a place that I feel like it's much better. And I don't feel it nearly as much with driving, with overall playing computer games or on the computer at all, or sleeping. And sleeping was the most important part. When I knew that improved, I knew I was onto something. And we need to make this consistent for everybody that has these type of symptoms. I'll continue to update you guys on the natural history of this. And when we say natural history, it means rotator cuff stuff like this. It's annoying. It takes longer than we think. So this is going to be an ongoing process for me still, even though I'm feeling better. We'll continue to post other rotator cuff type videos and advice that we can give you because we know they're incredibly frustrating. So if you want to see those, if you want to dive a little bit more into this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or check out any of our other content on any of our social media sites so you can kind of check out what we're doing for my own personal shoulder to make sure that I'm getting better the same way I'm helping my patients get better.